Okay.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
Today we have the pleasure of listening to the story of Keith Walston, son of our friend and neighbor, Bill and Sharon Walston, who has their whole family here. Keith and his wife, Laura, moved to Hilton Head Island in 1990 and became involved with the Vagabond Cruise in Harbortown, Sea Pines Plantation. Over the last 30 years, first as an employee and later as the owner of Vagabond Cruise, during that time, Keith and Laura have grown Vagabond Cruise Line into the largest sightseeing and excursion cruise operator in Hilton Head area, with boats including America's Cup sailboat, the Stars and Stripes, the Spirit of Harbortown, the only boat with a regular schedule to Savannah, a shrimp boat, and several other ventures in the Hilton Head and Savannah, Georgia area. Keith has an interesting story to tell us about his iconic island business. Please join me in welcoming Captain Keith Walston.
Thank you, Lee. My name is Keith Walston, and I want to share with you the story of one of Hilton Head Island's oldest continuously operating businesses. There are only a handful of those businesses left today, and so I am privileged to be a steward of this one. The story of Vagabond Cruise is actually really the story of 3 families and more than 50 years under that iconic lighthouse in Harbortown. It's also a story of entrepreneurship, resilience, and the evolution of Hilton Head Island itself. Before I get started with this, I think it's important that we, for me anyway, this is all because of God's grace. So I'm here today by His grace, my parents, my family. You know, when you build a life and when you participate in something like this, you look backwards on it. And that's really been something that I've been thinking about a lot while I've been putting this talk together. We get really good at seeing God's grace in the rearview mirror. At least I do anyway. And so I spent the last 10 or 12 days looking backwards. And so much good stuff to look at. So many memories, so many fun stuff. But when you think about the grace of being raised right by good parents, the grace of marrying a good woman. And you say, if I could have just looked forward, or if I could have just looked in the moment and saw that grace, what difference would that make? So as we go forward from here, I think we want to see God's grace in our lives every day. And we want to look forward to that grace tomorrow and the day after. So let's tell a little story. So as Lee said, I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, as the son of Bill and Sharon Walston. I attended Pennsylvania State University, and actually, when I finished at Penn State, I moved to Atlanta, Georgia, and took a job as a staff accountant for a small facilities maintenance company in Atlanta. We managed HVAC, mechanical, janitorial, custodial, for large facilities. Delta Airlines was our largest client. At their gates and ramps, at their flight attendant training center, we cleaned all their bathrooms. We were the people in the little cart that drove you around when you needed help. That was all of our staff. There was a crew of about 12 of us in the corporate office at that time, managing a team of over 2,000 people in the field, from San Francisco to New York to Miami and Atlanta. We also cleaned 3 IRS service centers, changed the light bulbs and the air filters, made sure those people were comfortable so they could audit your taxes and do your work. It's an interesting company and an interesting business. And I don't want to go on a lecture all about business management, but that's a 3% margin business. And so it requires you to be pretty tight. But I figured out pretty quickly that I did not want to work in a cube, in a high-rise, counting Windex bottles and cases of toilet paper. That just wasn't for me. I met Laura, my wife, there. While I was working there, she interviewed and was hired as the executive assistant to the owner. We actually met in an elevator. It was actually the true story. She was coming up to interview for work, and that's where we met. But I had vacationed on Hilton Head as a child. My parents owned, and actually still own today, Week 28, and now Week 29 at Ocean Cove over in Palmetto Dunes. And some of you may know this, but my mom goes on vacation every summer. She disappears from Tidepointe, disappears from the care center, shirks all of her duties, and makes that long journey all the way to Palmetto Dunes and spends 2 weeks at the beach. She makes my dad pack her clothes and the suitcase and food and everything else, and they leave here and they go set up camp over in Palmetto Dunes. My dad comes back here during the daytime and watches Fox News and goes to exercise class and does all that. But so that started for us when I was like, I don't know, 8 or 10 years old or something, very young. And so I came here all those years when I was a kid, and I always swore one day that I would end up back here. And that company in Atlanta was having some issues, and Laura left, and I decided I wasn't going to go to jail for anybody. So I called her and said, I'm going to Hilton Head. I'm going to get a job and work and maybe go back to school or do something. I don't know. Do you want to come with me? And so she left Moultrie and came here. And this story is not about me, but my dad wanted me to talk about my background for a minute, so I'm going to go on for just another second or two. So we arrived here in January of 1990. We got a room at the Red Roof Inn and an island packet. And this was before cell phones. This was really before the internet. So we got dimes to put in the cell phone because they were only Hardware only charged 10 cents for a payphone on Hilton Head back in those days. And we started calling help wanted ads. Laura managed to get a job as an assistant manager at the Carolina Closet. For those of you who've been here for a while, remember the enclosed mall at Shelter Cove, where Kroger is now. Carolina Closet was in there. The Ronchettis owned it at that time. They hired Laura to be an assistant manager there. And I called and called numbers and finally got a hold. I called for an ad for a mate's job on the Vagabond. And Captain Stan answered that call. I interviewed with him. I didn't realize that he was in Florida because I didn't know the area code, so I had to keep putting money in the payment. Stan was a very talkative guy, very loquacious. So after a very long interview, he said I would do. The thing is with Stan, a couple things. One, he's very thrifty, so he hired me on at $5 an hour. And at that time, they were living in Florida during the winters. Actually, they always lived in Florida in the winters, and I didn't realize that that's where I was calling. This was in January. He said, I'll be back in April. Keep track of your hours. If the boat's painted, I'll pay you. It's okay, that sounds fair. So he said the key to the boat is hidden under the fire hose on the starboard side by the gangway. There's paint below deck. I'll see you in April. So I did. I'd never painted a boat before. I didn't really know much about boats. But it seemed like a good idea. So I did. So Laura went to work at Carolina Closet and I painted the Vagabond. And Stan showed up in April and handed me a checkbook box with cash in it. And that's how it started. And so that was February 1st of 90 when I started work for him. So we've been here, Laura and I have been here for 36 years now. So quite a story, great place to raise a family, build a future, and build a business. But like I said before, I think the real story here is this iconic business, Vagabond Cruise. It's been in Harbortown since 1970, and there have been 3 families who've owned it. And we're going to talk about those in just a minute here. But I think as integral to the story of Vagabond Cruise is the story of Charles Fraser. You can't tell the story of Vagabond Cruise without recognizing its participation in Sea Pines Resort and the incredible influence that Charles Fraser and those early executives of the Sea Pines Company had shaping Harbortown, shaping Sea Pines, and actually shaping Hilton Head Island. And it's that process that led Jim and Vi Nesbitt to bring the first Vagabond to Harbortown. So I'm going to take a minute and just talk about that. I don't know how familiar you are with the Sea Pines story, but it actually leads straight to Vagabond Cruise. I met a very interesting man a little while ago, a man named Ned Fraser. He lives in Sea Pines Resort. RT, you may know him. He used to be an executive at Sea Pines. And he, more than anybody else, is the reason that Vagabond Cruise is here. I actually got to take him to lunch at Charlie's not too long ago and had a great afternoon with him of storytelling and understanding and filling in all the holes I didn't know. But before I go into all that, let's just take a quick minute to talk about Sea Pines. And I normally don't read from a text when I speak in public. I'm just not that disciplined. But in this case, this is not information that I just inherently know. So bear with me while I go through just a few pieces of the history of Charles Fraser and the Sea Pines Resort. Sea Pines was founded in 1956 by Charles Fraser. Charles was the son of General Joseph B. Fraser and Pearl Fraser. Among other things, General Fraser commanded the 48th Armored Division and served in active duty during World War I, World War II, and was a reserve officer during the Korean War. In 1949, while Charles Fraser was still in college and his father was still serving in the military, his father, General Fraser, along with Fred Hack, Olin McIntosh, and C.C. Stebbins, formed a logging and timber company and named it the Hilton Head Company. They purchased approximately 20,000 acres on the southern end of Hilton Head. And if you wonder what 20,000 acres looks like, it basically looks like from Palmetto Bay Marina to the Holiday Inn oceanfront down there to the tip of South Beach Marina. This whole chunk of Hilton Head was owned by Charles Fraser. Charles's father, General Joseph B. Fraser, that whole family is based out of Hinesville, Georgia. They were a timber family. And so even though General Fraser was serving in active duty military, his family was able to participate in that with him. Charles spent the summer of 1950 working at his father's timber camp located in Calabogie Cay in what is now Sea Pines Resort. They used to cut the timber on Hilton Head, and they would float it up the Savannah River on the tide to the mills. This was before we had a bridge, right? This was a long time ago. Fraser worked with the timber crews that summer harvesting and replanting pine trees. At that time, there were about 500 people that lived here. And we joke, they basically had 3 constituencies. These were freed slaves, or descendants of freed slaves, the 40 acres and a mule that we talk about. They were carpetbagging Yankees who were too broke or too unwelcome to go back up north after the Civil War, or they were Fraser's employees. That was about all that was left here. We talk about Reconstruction in the South. That's a subject we're all familiar with, right? Reconstruction rebuilt Atlanta and Richmond, Virginia, and a host of other cities. Reconstruction sailed right by Hilton Head and Nefusky Island. Not a single dime was invested here. So these islands really fell into an economic backwater. populated mostly by subsistence farmers and fishermen until the timber industry really got involved. So at the time that all this was happening, there were about 500 people living here on this island. In 1955, after graduating from Yale Law School, Charles signed a 20-year note payable to his father's company and purchased his father's interest in the Hilton Head Company and began to develop sea pines and set the course for Hilton Head Island as we know today. What follows is a brief timeline. 1957, which I didn't realize that's earlier than I thought, they sell the first lots in Sea Pines Plantation. 1959, they opened the William Hilton Inn. That was a hotel that used to sit down where the Marriott Grand Ocean Resort is now. I've got some pictures of some of this. I don't work with my hands and my... Actually, this is the first time I've ever used a PowerPoint. I am like the non-tech guy. So that's a picture of my family. This was our move to Hilton Head in 1990. We were young. Look at that picture. That was what I looked like when I started working for Stan. So we'll get up to Charles Fraser. So there's Charles, the son of Joseph B. Fraser. These guys walk in. There's an early model of Harbortown down there on the right side of the bottom corner. I don't think I have a picture of the William Hilton Inn. I don't. So 1959, he opens the William Hilton Inn, which is a 56-room hotel on the present-day site of the Marriott Grand Ocean. He built that hotel so that he would have a place to put people when they were trying to sell them lots. Because you couldn't drive here. I mean, they hadn't even built the swing bridge yet, let alone the bridge we have out here today that they're talking about replacing. So to come look at real estate on Hilton Head was a journey. It involved a boat, a drive through the wilderness of South Carolina. This was all completely wilderness. Bluffton barely existed. So he built that hotel so they would have a place to stay. In 1967 through 69, he constructed Harbortown with its signature red and white lighthouse and, of course, the marina. The shops in Harbortown, I mean, Charles traveled extensively. Obviously, his father and his family were wealthy. He had been to Italy. In fact, he'd been to Portofino. So when you look at the style of architecture in Harbortown, Charles's inspiration for those shops with the residential above the retail below, that was modeled after Portofino. And he envisioned Harbortown as this little Portofino-esque experience. And then he also loved New England. And he built South Beach. And you go to South Beach, it looks like a New England fishing village. Imagine you've got 20,000 acres, a bunch of money, and a wild imagination, and you can just create the experiences that you want. It must have been absolutely fantastic. In 1968, they complete the Harbortown Golf Links, which was designed by Jack Nicklaus and Pete Dye. That was also the same year that they received the first ever Certificate of Excellence in Private Community Planning by the American Institute for Architects. They'd never given that award before. And in 1969, he helped found the Heritage Classic Foundation, which is when they hosted the first Heritage Golf Tournament. So while working for his father cutting timber and roaming the island, Charles fell in love with Hilton Head, its natural beauty and the surrounding waterways. He wanted something more than a timber preserve here. He knew there was more value in this land than in just harvesting pine trees and making pulpwood. So with the marina completed, he wanted to find somebody to offer boat rides to prospective customers and new residents. Among Charles' executives was a gentleman named Ned McNair, who was Charles' Vice President of Fun and Sizzle. That was actually his job title. That was his actual title. Charles hired him to create a fun and active lifestyle inside of Sea Pines Resort. Again, because there was nothing else here. This wasn't here. Holman and Deans wasn't here. I mean, that was it. You came to Hilton Head, you actually came to Sea Pines. So it had to be fun. It had to fill up your days. And you could only play so much golf or so much tennis. So Charles charged Ned McNair with finding an operator to come to Hilton Head Island to offer cruises. And this is the product of my lunch with Ned McNair. In the 1960s, Charles purchased several thousand acres on Cumberland Island in Georgia, just to the south of us. He purchased that land from the family of Thomas Carnegie. Thomas Carnegie, of course, is the brother of Andrew Carnegie. Managing the estate, its hunting, its fishing, sailing activities, and running the ferry over and back was a couple from Florida named Jim and Vi Nesbitt. Jim and Vi had lived in Florida in the winter, operating a shanty boat cruise business from their home in Fort Myers and running a windjammer operation in Maine in the summers. What's particularly interesting about Ned's story, and I'm going to quote directly from his Substack article here. Charles Fraser charged Ned McNair to find somebody to operate this boat in Harbortown. So the week before, and now mind you, he just bought the property in Cumberland and had met this Jim Nesbitt guy. So the week before Ned McNair leaves to go to Cumberland Island, Charles gives him this charge. Ned, there is no way for island visitors to get out on the water except to charter a captain's sailboat or sport fishing boat, which is expensive and there are only two options. I want you to find a small ad in Audubon magazine about a nature barge trip to the Everglades. Find this man on Cumberland Island that put this ad and see if you can get him to come to Hilton Head. This is the kind of man that we need. Now, this tells you how different Americans were in 1960. And I'll talk more about Jim Nesbitt in a minute, but in Florida, in Fort Myers, and Laura's been on this property, and so have I, Jim Nesbitt operated a shanty boat cruise. This was a converted barge with a homemade engine, with no hot water, and no air conditioning, and a shared bathroom at the end of the hall. Jim and Vi Nesbitt, and later the people I bought Vagabond Cruise from, would offer 5-day cruises up the Caloosahatchee, through the locks, up into LaBelle, Florida, where you could do nature sightseeing and birding and so forth. Some of the highlights of the trip included Jim playing guitar on the upper deck for sing-alongs. They had a cook who prepared meals on board. They pulled off the side of the river above LaBelle, and they had an old hermit that lived on an island there. And Jim had given him a deuce and a half, the old military transport truck, and they had outfitted it as a mobile camp. They would cut down a palm tree, slice out the heart of the palm, roast it over an open fire, and have that for dinner, and then get back on the boat. Without air conditioning, without hot water, for 5 days. You couldn't sell that trip today if you tried. Americans are just not that tough. So this was the background of Jim Nesbitt. So he sells the shanty boat business in Florida. Jim, and I'll talk about this in a minute, Jim was a very restless soul, so he takes the job on Cumberland Island as the caretaker, and that's where he runs into Ned McNair. So Charles dispatched Ned McNair to Cumberland Island to convince the Nesbitts to come to Hilton Head and begin operating in Harbortown. After 2 days of hard sailing from Hilton Head down to Cumberland Island, which is an amusing story, and if you want to actually read this story, come find me later. I'll tell you how to find Ned McNair's Substack. He lands on Cumberland Island and goes ashore, and he says, "Perhaps you know a guy I'm looking for." I gave him the whole quest that Charles Fraser had just given me 3 days before I got on the boat. Told him the whole story about the Audubon ad. And this guy says, "I do know him, Ned. I'm the guy. I'm Jim Nesbitt." And he said, "I just sold my Florida operation." And Ned McNair asked him, "Well, how long do you plan to stay here?" And he says, "Well, I actually just quit. This is not for me." He said, "I'm looking for my next gig." And so with that, Ned McNair offered Harbortown to Jim Nesbitt. So in 1970, Jim Nesbitt sailed into Harbortown with the first Vagabond, a converted World War II PT boat that Jim and Vi had worked on that winter. So the Nesbitts ran the business for 4 years, from 1970 through 1974. Jim was a consummate entrepreneur. He named the boat Vagabond because that's what he was. You could just never keep him in one place for too long. So for 4 years he built that business up. What's interesting though, and what follows in the history of the story here, is that before he was in the shanty boat business in Florida, he had a boat on the public docks in Erie, Pennsylvania, right down there at Prescott Park, if you've ever been there. And he ran that boat there for a number of years. And a couple by the name of Stan and Sally Maurer, who were school teachers, musicians, photographers, that Captain Stan and Sally were entrepreneurs. They did a little of everything. Captain Stan got into the boat business there and competed with Jim Nesbitt. And they went back and forth, and then Jim, of course, got bored with Erie, moved to Florida, and opened the shanty boat business. Stan and Sally stayed in Erie doing school book photographs. Stan actually played in a swing band for extra money. Nesbitt's went to Florida. Jim got bored with that. Sold the business, moved up to Cumberland Island. Got sold by Charles Frazier's man to put the Vagabond in Harbortown. And he calls Stan and says, hey, the guy I sold the shanty boat business to isn't working out. Will you come buy the shanty boat business in Florida? So Stan and Sally make the trek down to Fort Myers, buy that boat business. Jim is in Harbortown running that. 4 years later, he's bored and he calls the Maurers and says, are you interested in buying the business in Hilton Head? Stan and Sally came up and looked at it, bought it in 1974, and for about 6 years ran both the shanty boat operation in Florida in the winters and the Vagabond up here in the summers. They actually used to take that boat, which is crazy, from Hilton Head Island down to their property in Fort Myers in the winter there in the early years, and they would do all their own painting and maintenance and upkeep. So Captain Stan started with a single boat in Harbortown. About 4 or 5 years later, actually sold the Florida business, and then began to expand the business on Hilton Head Island. Over the years, Stan expanded the business. Over the years, Stan expanded the business. That's a picture of Captain Stan there. Expanded the business, adding to it the Gypsy and the Drifter, somewhere in here. So this is a picture of the Drifter. And there's actually, I believe this is a picture of me. I had long hair and a green shirt. And I think that's me, and that might be Scott in the yellow shirt, I'm not sure. On the Drifter when we were little kids. So Stan expanded the fleet in Harbortown. There's a great shot of all three of his Harbortown boats there, the Drifter and the Gypsy. And so he was doing that through the late 1970s and into the early 80s. Now, Stan was an excellent marketer, a great operator, a perfect showman, could give a great narration, but Stan was not very good at boat maintenance. He was one of the most frugal people I've ever met. In 1980, while they were in Florida, the Drifter sank at the dock in Harbortown. And the Gypsy wasn't far behind. And so they actually told Stan those two boats have to go. By then, Stan had opened the operation in South Beach. And so he sold the operation in South Beach to the Klippels. Robert and Jennifer Klippel are the sons, Joan and, his name escapes me at the moment, the husband bought it so their kids could have a business to run. The Gypsy went with them, and they fished the Drifter out, and I don't actually know what became of her. So by 1981, Captain Stan was down to one boat. Thought I had a better shot of the old vagabond. I did, that PT boat. He was down just to that. But she was showing her age as well. And Seaplanes had told him that boat has to go. That was a World War II PT boat. It actually served active duty as well. So it was showing its age. So in 1982, Captain Stan built the Vagabond II, the second one, which is the one if you go to Harbortown you'll see today. Stan was a romantic. Stan had a good eye for aesthetic. He drew that boat basically on a piece of paper and sent it to the architect. He wanted a boat with a real high bow, that destroyer-style wheelhouse with the angled windows that look back, with a bunch of different decks so that people could get up on the boat and up top and out in front and beside. It has a little interior salon area with snack bars you can go sit. You would never build a boat like that today. You would build a rectangle with a point on the end so you could get the maximum amount of people with the smallest amount of space. You would be building a boat for yield. Stan didn't build for yield, he built for aesthetic. And he created a really cool special boat. So he sent that drawing to a young architect named Andy LeBay down in Jacksonville, Florida. And Andy turned Stan's drawing into that boat. Stan had that boat built down at Freeport Shipbuilding in Freeport, Florida. And in 1982, he and his son Mark sailed it into Harbortown. I own that boat. That boat's still in Harbortown today. Of all the boats we have, and we have a bunch of them, it is my absolute favorite. It's the only one that I willingly sign up to drive. I've got this big, nice air-conditioned dinner cruise boat with an air-conditioned wheelhouse that it just doesn't have the soul that boat has. So he builds the Vagabond in 1982, and I think kind of gets re-energized, right? It's time to get back in the game. I've had one sunk, I sold one off, you know. So he starts to grow the business. The next one he builds is the Spirit of Harbortown in 1993. And the inspiration for this boat, the reason he built this boat, was a young man named Billy McCormick. Billy was a wealthy kid here on the island. His father was a very successful man. And he had set his son up in a sailboat rental business that had the slip next to the Vagabond. Billy and Stan didn't really get along particularly well. I think Bill had a pretty good disdain, or Stan had a pretty good disdain for somebody that didn't start with nothing and build their way up. And Billy couldn't grasp Stan in any way, shape, or form. But the one thing about the Vagabond, I don't think this picture shows it. Yeah, it does. There's those exhaust stacks up top there. When it rains, water would get in them. And when you started the engines, it would blow a little bit of black soot out of the stack. Well, Billy had all these white sailboats. They were perfectly clean and well maintained. Stan would come down there and crank the boat up for that first trip, and it would blow soot on Billy's boats. And it infuriated him. And Stan could have cared less. So one day, I guess rain was forecast. I was there. Billy had come down early in the morning and put wet towels over the exhaust stacks, thinking that it would capture that soot, which, you know, is not a bad thought, but it creates back pressure in the engine. And so when Stan cranked up those two engines, both engines backfired, belched a bunch of black smoke, shot the rags up onto the upper deck. Stan was furious. He had enough of young Mr. Billy McCormick. So he decided that he would get rid of him. And the best way to get rid of him was to put something better in that slip. At that time, running Harbortown, of course by now, Charles Frazier's bankrupt, right? The resort's been sold off piecemeal like a carved up turkey at Thanksgiving. And Harbortown is owned by a guy named Avram Fogelman, who worked with Prudential Base to redevelop it into a master limited partnership. Managing that partnership for Prubage Fogelman was Club Group. And so our direct landlord was the Club Group. Mark King was the president. And Stan went to Mark King and said, hey, I've got this idea. I'm going to build a dinner cruise boat. It's going to be air conditioned, nothing like Hilton Head has ever seen. And so he did. And he said the only slip it'll fit in, of course, is young Billy McCormick's slip. So the sailboat business is doing, I don't know, $50,000, $75,000 a year, and this boat should do, close to $1 million. So it was a no-brainer for Sea Pines. So the Spirit of Harbortown arrives in 1993. Stan's having a great time. He's a relatively young guy. There's a picture of him. Stan's on the right. That's Captain Ben Edelman, who was the original captain on the Spirit of Harbortown when it arrived. And then that's Stan's wife, Sally, right there. So that's Stan and Sally Maurer. That's family too. I looked all over for a picture of Jim and Vi Nesbitt, searched my office, turned it upside down, and couldn't find a picture of them. I even called Stan's son, Mark, to see if he had a picture, but he couldn't find one. So, following on the heels of the Spirit of Harbortown in 1993, there was a sailboat charter business, sailing business in Harbortown with a boat called Cheers. Cheers was a beautiful 47-foot Nelson Merritt design Morgan. Beautiful, beautiful boat. Stan tried to buy it, thought he had a deal cut, and then Club Group said, no, we're not even going to keep that boat here. We're kicking, since the owners got it for sale, we're just going to go ahead and get rid of him. A gentleman named Rick Peterson, who used to own Old Oyster Factory and Redfish at the time, fancied himself that he might be a sailor. So he talked them into letting him bring a sailboat to Harbortown. Rick's an excellent restaurateur, can make money hand over fist and run a quality food and beverage operation. Didn't know diddly about boats. Bought an old sailing yacht. It turns out to have been completely, substantially rehabilitated outside the United States. Was unable legally to get permitted. After 3 years of fooling around with Rick Peterson and his failed endeavor with the Firebird, and then later a replica of Joshua Slocum's sailboat, the Spray, which also didn't work out. They approached Stan and said, we'd like to talk to you about that sailboat thing again. So in 1995, it'll be 95, they told Stan, if you can find a sailboat, we'd like to do it. So I was managing the business for Stan by that time. And this was a great opportunity to grow with another boat, try to get control of this harbor. And I knew Cheers worked really well, because at that time, that Cheers show was very popular on TV. Ted Danson and Shelley Long. Yep. So that was a hook. People would buy those tickets just to get on that boat because they were actually using the logo from the show on the boat, which I'm sure is a violation of the trademark. I'm sure. I knew Ron Coleman, the owner of that boat. I know Ron did not call Hollywood and get permission to do that. But I watched how popular it was, so I thought, we need a hook. We don't just need a sailboat, we need the sailboat. And so I looked at an old a whipbread boat, Stonelager. It was too big, couldn't fit in the harbor. And I found a guy in Barrington, Rhode Island, who had 3 America's Cup 12 meters. He was going to start the America's Cup school for people who wanted to learn how to drive these boats. Somehow he convinced Fleet First Boston to give him the money to do this. Now, that is a pretty thin customer profile. So needless to say, that business didn't work. I actually started negotiating with him to buy that boat. In the process of it, he got foreclosed on, and I couldn't get anybody to talk to me. And I was actually almost ready to purchase another boat that we had located in Florida, and we were just going to fabricate some kind of a hook. When I got a phone call from a young broker in New York, he said, I got a banker's box full of papers on these 3 derelict boats. And somewhere in here is your name, and it says you're interested in them. I said, well, I'm only interested in one. He said, well, you have to take all 3. I said, that won't work. I said, I'll take one, and I know which one I want. So I flew up there with our architect, met him there. This kid was real young. I was young. He was younger than me. But we cut a deal to buy the America's Cup yacht, Stars and Stripes, from from that Boston bank, Complete First Boston, out of bankruptcy. We shoveled snow off it to look at it. All the masts for all 3 sailboats were piled up against the shed on the side of the building. We couldn't tell which one was what, but the naval architect and I looked at them, tried to pick out what appeared to be the best one, and said that mast goes with that boat. That would have been in December of '95. We bought the boat right after New Year's, loaded it onto 2 different tractor trailer trucks. This is the boat with the wing keel. I don't know if some of you may remember that. Real secretive. They would send a diver down and put a canvas around it when they weren't racing it so that spies could come look at this unique wing keel. To get it to Savannah, Georgia, where we refit it, we had to take the keel off the boat, put it on a tractor trailer truck with the mast, and put the boat on a second tractor trailer truck. Truck all that down to Savannah, Georgia. And the deal Stan cut with Harbortown was that he would have it there by July 4th, which was insane. But we got it done. I hired this architect in Charleston, and when you convert a boat like this from non-commercial service to commercial service, you have to go through the United States Coast Guard. You have to send your drawings and your specifications up to Washington, D.C., where their engineers and architects review it and approve it and let you proceed. Nobody does that. Everybody builds a Coast Guard inspected boat from scratch because it's just too hard to convert something that was never meant to be into that. But I was too young and too dumb, and Stan, for whatever reason, wasn't, but supported the project. We were sending drawings to Washington, D.C. About 5 days ahead of the welders and fabricators to keep the project going. I learned a lot about that project. I learned a lot about what not to do. Somehow Stan and I figured that between buying the boat and doing the work, it would cost about $300,000. That was a bit of an underestimate. So we needed to put an engine in it. The engine distributor offered to loan us the money to build the boat, as long as we would use their engine, because they had just become a dealer for Volvo Marine Diesels. So we go and borrow the money, take the boat to the shipyard in Thunderbolt. We start doing the work. We get about a third of the way along. The boat is cut open. It's not seaworthy. And we realize we're going to run out of money. And Stan said, well, Keith, you're just going to have to call the bank and tell them we need a bigger loan. I was like 28, I think, or something, 27 years old. And I thought, this is going to be fun. So I call up to Atlanta, this older southern gentleman. So here's the deal. The boat's a third of the way down. It's not seaworthy. We're out of cash. We need more money. He cursed me, hung up on me. I called Stan. He said, he'll call you back. So Stan told me, he said, banks hate boats. There's no worse collateral than a boat. So he did call back. And then he drove down here. And then he cursed me some more. And he gave us another $300,000 to finish the boat. So that's how Stars and Stripes ended up in Harbortown. And we did actually make it for July 4th in 1996. Some cool things during 1996. Atlanta was picked to host the U.S. Olympics. The sailing events were down off of Tybee Island, Georgia, down in Wausau Sound. The Olympic sailing events. We actually were picked as a spectator boat for the Olympics. And there's mine and Laura's IDs for the Olympic Games and some tickets and pictures and so forth. And so that's 1996. Stan and I are running the company. Also at that time, Stan had told me if I run the business for him for 7 years, this was in 1994, if I run the business for him for 7 years, he'll pay me $30,000 a year. And then he'll sell me the business at the end of that 7 years. And Laura had to agree to come on board and be the bookkeeper for like $2 an hour or something. It was some nominal amount of money, so we did it. So we were running the business, Laura was keeping the books, I was running the company. And then in 2001, we were able to purchase the business from Captain Stan and Sally Maurer. And I'm running out of time. I told my dad I have about 2 hours of material. I'm going to try and get this down to 45 minutes. And Laura's over there pointing at her watch. There's a giant clock right there in the back, just trying to keep me on time here. Part of the deal with that employment agreement with Stan was that I would give him $20,000 down, and he would give me a note payable for $2.8 million. Yeah, who does that, right? Who does 99.8% under financing, right? Well, Stan sold me the business for what was really about $1 million more than it was worth, and I figured that out the hard way. Cash flow was very tight. I remember running dolphin cruises to get enough money to buy groceries to cook Christmas dinner when my parents came to visit. I mean, I really grossly overpaid for the business. But, you know, we're here, we're still alive. So we fast forward, Laura and I added the Tammy Jane to the fleet in 2016. That's our shrimp trawler, yeah. So we've got pictures in the wintertime, we go crabbing, we do our own little version of Deadliest Catch. And then in the summertime, of course, we're dragging nets and shrimp trawler. No story about Vagabond Cruise would be complete without talking about some of the challenges that we've incurred. We bought the business in March of 2001. Everybody remembers where they were on that day in September of 2001 when they flew those planes into the buildings, right? Half my book, charter book, disappeared on September 12th. Pretty big blow to cash flow following that. So that brings us up to a couple of good hurricane stories. We've got images of both hurricanes here. The big image in the center is the image of Harbortown after Hurricane Matthew struck. This picture is shot from the apron below the 18th green, between the fairway and the green. Those are the floating docks that used to be over where the pier was. They ended up along the 18th fairway of the Harbortown golf links. Out there in the distance, you can see these pilings sticking up here. This used to be the pier. And this is the decking from the pier that got blown off from the wind and the wave action in that storm. That's my crew on the left, coming back from anchoring the boats out for that hurricane. It was wet, it was a tough day. That's in October, so it was a little bit chilly. And then the pictures on the bottom three, or the one on the right, the one on the bottom left, and the bottom. That's from Hurricane Irma. That followed in 2017. Not a very bad storm, actually. Laura and I were in Harbortown with Greg Russell and Phil Smith, and the sledgehammer and the pry bar keeping the floating docks from carrying away. That's another good story, but Joy will kill me. But that storm didn't have a lot of wind, but it brought in a lot of water. That image on the bottom left corner there is an image of the quarterdeck restaurant. You should be standing there. Instead, it's under about 4 feet of water. We survived Hurricane Matthew. Our fleet survived just fine. They were anchored back in the creek behind the Fusky. But during Hurricane Irma, which was a much gentler storm, the Spirit of Harbortown was hit by a tornado. It exploded one of the anchor lines, dragged the other anchor 3 miles to the back of Palmetto Bluff and set it in the marsh back there. It took me a week with an excavator and water jets to dig that boat out. Following that came COVID. And, you know, I was raised by my dad, like my brother Scott was there. And we earned from the time we could walk. You had paper routes, you shoveled driveways, you cut grass, you earned every day. So from the time I could deliver newspapers until then, I always earned. When we shut that business down that first week of March, it's the first time in my memory that I wasn't making money. It was a crazy time for all of us in America. But by May, we were open back up, and we actually had our best year ever. South Carolina is a very attractive state compared to New York, New Jersey, Michigan, Minnesota, all those crazy states up there with the politics. People came down. I know, I'm not supposed to say that. But South Carolina, as we call it, the free state of South Carolina, you could come down here and you could get in the water and you could swim and you could eat at a restaurant and you didn't have to play flute through a mask and all that other crazy stuff. All the kids were being homeschooled. Dad was working remote. And so you could either work remote from Cleveland or you could work remote from Hilton Head. It was really a no-brainer, right? So the island filled up, and the years following COVID were some of our best years. So here's where we are today. This is the current fleet. Stars and Stripes on the left there, the Vagabond on the bottom, Spirit of Harbortown on the top in the middle, the Tammy Jane in the bottom right, and then that's our newest boat. The Solaris. That's our luxury VIP sort of experience. It is an absolutely gorgeous 2021 Chris Craft Launch 34. Just a beautiful old James Bondy kind of sexy yacht that we do VIP stuff on. So that's our fleet today. There it is. There's a good shot of Solaris. And then we haven't just been content with staying in Harbortown. In 2024, we added Savannah Harbor Cruises and River Street Landing in Savannah. We were fortunate enough to be able to get a hold of a little marina there on River Street, and we put a boat in there as well. And then last year, I have some younger guys that work for me that asked me to join them in this crazy water sports venture on Tybee Island, so I'm a partner with them. Laura keeps the books for them. We do wave runners, tiki boat, pontoon boat rentals. So we just keep growing and moving forward. I wanted to go into this, and we don't have time, but we could talk marketing sometime later. But what we really are is a marketing company. You know, we're not a boat business. I don't get up every morning and think about how to drive the boat straighter. I get up every morning and think about how to put another 1,000 people on the boat. And we could talk for an hour about what's changed in marketing from 1990 to 2026, but we really are at the top of the game here. And Stan taught me that. Stan would spend no money on maintenance, but would double down on advertising. And that's why he was successful. He understood that he had to sell the experience, and so I learned that from him. The methods and the techniques have changed, you know, wildly, but it's the same thought. It's the same thing that he taught me. So that is it. 80,000 passengers a year we carry. Run about 1,200 cruises through 5 different boats in the fleet. God has been incredibly good to us. That's a picture of some of my fantastic crew. He's let us build a team. Run the business in such a way that we can do health insurance and 401ks and pay time off, stuff nobody else in this industry around here does. And because of that, that allows me to build this really great team that allows us to be so super successful. All right, according to the master clock, we have 6 minutes. Yes.
My son Bob Campbell crewed with Dennis Conner
Ah.
on Stars and Stripes.
Great.
And I went to a lot of those races in Newport, Rhode Island.
You know, that was such an opportunity to purchase that boat.
Right.
And I actually keep in touch with Billy Trinkle,